Welcome to Libertas Europae. You've probably seen something like this on the internet before. Even if you haven't, you're probably familiar with the general argument that's behind images like this. And it's that Christianity is this anti-science religion that places blind faith over reason, as can, for example, be seen in the Galileo affair, and the Catholic Church, particularly in the Middle Ages, just suppressed scientists because they feared that their discoveries might contradict Holy Scripture. And this is why the Roman Empire collapsed shortly after it became Christian. This has led to drastic scientific regression in the Middle Ages, and then you have this millennium of darkness where people are just dumb and ignorant and superstitious, before then finally in the Renaissance people overcome this religious dogma, they regain the knowledge of the classical world, and this then leads to science to take off with the Enlightenment and the Age of Science. Now, before we get into any of the actual history, this graph should be highly suspicious. I mean, what is scientific advancement supposed to mean? This is a mushy concept. It's not clear what this is supposed to be. In science, if you have some sort of concept like this, you have to operationalize it if you want to collect actual data. So, for example, you want to have something like you want to measure the health of a particular nation. You can't just have a graph that says, health, and then you have, Norway and Zimbabwe and whatever, and you see, okay, Norway has this many points of health and Zimbabwe has fewer points of health, therefore Norwegians are healthier than Zimbabweans or something like that. That would be nonsense. You would have to operationalize this concept of health somehow. You could look, for example, at life expectancy. And for a concept like health, there is no one standard way of operationalizing it. For some things we have standard concepts, like for intelligence we have IQ, and IQ is not exactly the same as intelligence, but it's universally recognized as being a sort of very good proxy for intelligence. Science, again, there wouldn't be any one particular metric that stands out. You could look at something like the number of scientific papers published, the number of patents, or something like that. Of course, that wouldn't work for the Middle Ages, the ancient period, but at least for modern period, that would make sense. I don't really know how you would operationalize scientific advancement, like in general. It's also not quite clear what sort of society they're looking at. Even today there are some primitive hunter-gatherer societies that are certainly technologically less advanced than Europeans were in the Middle Ages. So whose scientific advancement are we measuring here? Is it Europe's? Then why is Egypt on this graph? Also, a lot of the Greco-Roman world is actually outside of Europe. Or maybe the idea is that we're looking at whatever society is currently most advanced, but then the creators of this meme would be shooting themselves in the foot, because that would mean then that Europe in the Middle Ages was the most advanced, which it really wasn't. However you slice it, this graph just doesn't make any sense. So many problems that haven't even started talking about history yet. So, according to this graph, science was far more advanced in the year 400 than in the year 1500. This makes no sense. Here's just a few of the technologies that were used in Europe in 1500 but not in 400. The three-field system of crop rotation, the horse collar, the stirrup, gunpowder weapons, paper, mechanical clocks, the compass, and sailing ships that were capable of crossing an ocean. What about the other way around? Basically nothing, hardly anything. There are certainly many pieces of writing from the ancient world that are forever lost, but in terms of actual science, technology, almost everything from the ancient world has been rediscovered by the time we get to the year 1500. So by any reasonable measure of scientific or technological development, Europe in 1500 is miles ahead of Europe in 400. Now, admittedly, during the Middle Ages, Europe does lag behind some other civilizations, notably China. But the blame for Europe falling behind can hardly be laid at the feet of Christianity. After all, after the fall of Rome in the West, it was almost exclusively churchmen who preserved what they could of the classical world. And when science and learning did begin to flourish again in Europe, somewhere around the year 1000, it was the church which led the way, and for many centuries, the church was the primary patron of the sciences. From an atheist perspective, you might complain that the church used its hegemony over education to promote theology over secular fields, and that's a fair criticism, but the fact remains that without the church, the Dark Ages would have been a lot darker. In the darkest parts of the Middle Ages, from let's say 500 to 800, hardly anyone who wasn't a cleric could actually read or write. Almost all of the written records, sparse as they are we have of that period, were recorded in monasteries. And without the efforts of the church, many more of the classical texts would be forever lost. But wait, what about Galileo? Isn't that a clear-cut case of the church suppressing scientific truth out of religious zealotry? Well, first of all, the Galileo affair took place in the 17th century, so it can hardly be made responsible for lack of scientific advancement in the Middle Ages. And then secondly, the Catholic Church declaring scientific theories to be heretical is highly unusual in its history. It's not at all typical of what the Church did during the Middle Ages or any other time period. And note that Copernicus was free to publish his heliocentric theories during the 16th century without any sort of condemnation from the Church. Now, I'm not here to defend the Catholic Church. What the Catholic Church and the Inquisition in particular did during the Galileo affair is certainly reprehensible. In 1616, they declared heliocentrism to be heretical, and then later in 1642, they sentenced Galileo to indefinite house arrest for continuing to promote heliocentrism. And that's certainly wrong. No question about that. However, we do need to take into account that this is not just a simple case of scripture trumping science. The reason the relevant church officials believed in geocentrism was not that they were blinded by religious faith. Rather, they were just looking at the scientific consensus, looking at the balance of the scientific evidence available at the time, and that just went against heliocentrism. Geocentrism just was standard science. To give you a taste of the scientific controversy that was raging at the time, let me present to you one of the chief arguments against heliocentrism and for geocentrism. This was the argument from the lack of observable stellar parallax, which was most notably advanced by the famous 16th century Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. Now, first I have to explain what parallax means. This is actually an everyday visual phenomenon. You have objects that appear at different angles from one another depending on your viewpoint. So for example, look at this illustration here. So we have an object and then there's a distant background, and you look at this object from two different points of view. Depending on which angle you look at the object, you see a different background against which this object appears. So depending on whether you look at viewpoint A or viewpoint B, the object appears against a different colored background. And of course, this everyday phenomenon should also be applicable to stellar objects. So here's the argument, and see if you can spot the error in this argument with the benefit of hindsight. So, number one, let's assume that the Earth orbits the Sun. So we're doing something like a proof by contradiction. If that is the case, then we should be able to observe stellar parallax. But with the best equipment available at the time, we are not able to observe stellar parallax. Number three, if 1 and 2 are true, then this must mean that the parallax is extremely small. And this implies that the distances between the Earth and the stars are so enormously large as to make the distance of Earth's orbit insignificant in comparison. Number four, if we know the distance of a star, we can use its angular diameter, that is how large it appears in our field of vision, to calculate its actual size. just like we can do for terrestrial objects. Number 5. Using these distances from 3 and the method from 4, we determined that all the stars would be much, much larger than the Sun. And in conclusion, that seems very unlikely. So, one of our assumptions must be false. And since all our logic is tight and airproof, the only assumption we made is that the Earth orbits the Sun. So this has to be false. So where's the mistake? Were you able to spot it? I'll give you a couple of seconds. So stellar parallax is indeed a thing, and we can measure it. It's just because the distance involved is so small that with the equipment available at the time, it just wasn't possible to measure it. It was first measured successfully in 1838 by the German astronomer Friedrich Bessel. We also know today that our Sun is a rather small star, but it isn't that much smaller than the other stars. It's sort of on the small side, but it's not completely unusual in its size. The actual problem lies with number 4. The method described here works perfectly fine using angular diameter to calculate the size of terrestrial objects, no problem, but it doesn't work with stellar objects. The stars actually appear larger to us than their real angular diameter because of the Earth's atmosphere and because of diffraction, but that's something that was only discovered much later. So Tycho Brahe's argument, although ultimately wrong, was very sophisticated and could not be adequately rebutted with the knowledge that was available in the 16th and 17th century. The Copernicans who did take on this argument actually invoked religion to try to explain away this embarrassing problem. They said something like, God can just make the stars as large and as distant as he pleases, no problem. Just God did it. At the end of the day, this Galileo affair is an aberration. For most of the Middle Ages and the early modern age, the Catholic Church was the greatest champion and benefactor of learning and science in Europe. While there are many legitimate criticisms to be made of the Church, the idea that they retarded scientific progress or that they plunged Europe into a millennium of darkness is just absurd. Contrary to popular portrayals, the Middle Ages was not a time of stagnation. Many advancements were made over the course of the Middle Ages. Europe in 1500 is completely different from Europe in 500. It's far more sophisticated, far more advanced. There's a lot more technology. And of course, if you look at scientific advancement during the Middle Ages and compared to scientific advancement over the last 200 years, of course, the Middle Ages were glacial in terms of the speed of advancement. But then that goes for any period in human history. And the fact that these Christian societies in the Middle Ages and the early modern period transformed into these highly sophisticated, highly innovative societies that built the modern world and radically transformed the way people live on this planet can hardly be used as evidence against Christianity. No non-Christian society had anywhere near this level of advancement, of growth, of scientific innovation as did the European Christian societies. Now you might argue that's coincidence. Maybe Europe without Christianity would have advanced even quicker. It's possible, but where's the evidence for that? Not like you can run this experiment again without Christianity. The evidence we have is that Christian societies do better than non-Christian societies. And construing that as an argument against Christianity is kind of disingenuous. I'm not a Christian myself, but let's be fair, shall we? So yes, let's continue to criticize Christianity for specific points where they specifically hold up or held up science. Particular Christians at particular times did that in some cases, but this sort of blanket condemnation of Christianity as being anti-science is just nonsense, and it has to stop. So, another historical myth down, only approximately infinite many to go. And if you want to keep following along on this journey, please subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and comment down below what you think of Christianity in the Middle Ages. And until next time, goodbye.